Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into what has to be the most famous idea Joseph Schumpeter ever developed. We're tackling Chapter 7 of Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, the chapter titled The Process of Creative Destruction.
Right. And it's much more than just a catchy phrase people throw around. It's really the analytical engine room of Schumpeter's whole argument about capitalism.
Okay.
So our goal today, I think, is to get past that soundbite. We need to pull out the analytical core, really understand why Schumpeter called this process the essential fact about capitalism.
Right, and how knowing that changes how we look at everything else.
Exactly. How we interpret market performance, policy, you name it. It shifts the whole perspective.
Okay, so let's set the stage a bit. Just quickly remind ourselves, and you the listener, where we left off last time we talked about Schumpeter, his big overarching question.
Can capitalism survive?
Exactly, and his reflections back then were all about, well, the sheer growth we've seen under capitalism, its plausibility as a system, but most importantly, its fundamentally dynamic nature. It's never still.
That's the absolute key starting point for this chapter, that dynamism. Schumpeter argues, pretty forcefully actually, that if you treat modern capitalism like it's just static, like an unchanging machine.
Like in some textbook models.
Right. Then any analysis you do is, in his words, fragmentary and ultimately meaningless. You're missing the movie if you only look at snapshots. He's basically forcing us and you listening to think in evolutionary terms if we want to get how this system actually creates so much wealth over time.
Okay, so evolutionary perspective, not static. Let's unpack that by looking at the views Schumpeter was arguing against. He takes aim at a couple of dominant, static ways people thought about monopolies and big companies back then.
Precisely. These were the common critiques, the ways people tried to explain or maybe complain about the rise of big business oligopolies, late 19th, early 20th century.
What was the first one?
The first one, we could call it secular sabotage. It's this really quite cynical view. It basically suggested that all the economic growth we saw happened in spite of the business leaders, the managing bourgeoisie.
So the bosses were actually trying to slow things down.
That's the idea in this
Yeah.
view, that they were engaged in this constant secular sabotage, holding back production. Any growth that happened was just because of, lucky external factors. Maybe new tech fell from the sky, or populations grew factors strong enough to kind of overcome the resistance from business itself.
Wow, okay. That's a pretty strong claim. The captains of industry actively working against progress.
It is. Schumpeter doesn't spend a huge amount of time refuting that one directly. Maybe he thought it was a bit over the top.
A bit thin.
Yeah. He really focuses his main critique on the second proposition, the one he saw as more widespread and, analytically flawed. He calls it the theory of the decline.
The decline. Okay, what's that one about?
This decline argument is probably more familiar. It says that capitalism once had this sort of golden age.
Perfect competition.
Exactly. A time of perfect or near perfect competition where everything worked efficiently, maximum output, all that. But then, the story goes, this golden age got ruined by the spread of monopolistic structures. Big companies, trusts, cartels, they supposedly came along and killed competition, leading to a decline in economic performance, efficiency, everything.
Right, that's the standard story. Monopoly bad, competition good. But Schumpeter attacks this on two fronts, right? First, the whole idea of a golden age.
Yeah, his first takedown is just, look, that premise is historically bunk. He says the whole idea involves the creation of an entirely imaginary golden age of perfect competition.
It never really existed like the textbooks say.
He argues it didn't. This perfect state supposedly existed and then somehow, poof, metamorphosed into the monopolistic age around, say, the 1890s.
Yeah.
Schumpeter just flatly rejects that. He says, perfect competition, that textbook model where everyone's a price taker.
Tiny firms, identical products.
Right? He says that model has at no time been more of a reality than it is at present. Meaning, it's always been more of a theoretical ideal than a historical fact.
That's a really key point. He's saying the ideal model we use to judge monopolies against was never actually the reality of how industries grew and changed. The real world was always messy, driven by big disruptive changes.
Exactly. Think about it historically. Railroads, steel mills, the first big factories, these weren't born out of perfect competition. They were often revolutionary, temporarily monopolistic forces driven by some new invention or organization.
Okay, so the historical premise of a golden age is shaky. What about the empirical evidence? The decline theory implies that when big business took over around the 1890s, economic progress should have slowed down, right?
Precisely. If monopolies kill performance, you'd expect to see a slowdown in output growth. So Schumpeter looks at the data, He examines the time series for total output.
Yeah.
And his observation is pretty blunt. There is nothing in the behavior of the time series of total output to suggest a break-in trend after the 1890s.
So despite the rise of these trusts and giants,
And the overall growth rate just kept going, maybe even accelerated. This basic macro fact throws that whole static critique into serious doubt right away. If big business was so bad, where's the evidence in the aggregate numbers?
But he doesn't stop at just total output. He brings in that, well, really brilliant metric, the one that connects to ordinary people's lives, the standard of living.
This is so crucial to his argument. He shifts from abstract aggregates to, what could people actually buy? He points out that the modern standard of life for the masses, which is just vastly higher than, say, 1760, evolved precisely during the period of relatively unfettered big business.
And he's careful about how we measure that standard of life, not just money prices because of inflation and stuff.
Absolutely. Just looking at the sticker price of a car in 1950 versus today doesn't tell you much, right? Quality changes, the value of money changes. So Schumpeter says, let's cut through that. The real measure of progress is the price in terms of the hours of labor that will buy them.
Right. How much of your life do you have to trade for something?
Exactly. You take the money price of the good and divide it by the average hourly wage. That tells you the real cost in human effort.
So what happened when he looked at that, the labor hour cost?
Well, he looked at the typical worker's budget, the things people actually bought from around 1899 onwards. And he says he was struck by the rate of the advance. The labor hour cost of goods fell dramatically.
Faster than before.
Yes. And when you add in the huge improvements in the quality of those goods over the same period, he finds the rate of advance seems to have been greater, not smaller, during this era of big business. The static theory predicted stagnation or decline. The reality showed acceleration.
Okay, so this leads directly to his famous, shocking suspicion. If the data flatly contradicts the theory that monopolies hurt consumers,
then something fundamental is wrong with the theory. It must be missing the real story. Where did this accelerated progress actually come from?
And Schumpeter follows the evidence.
He does. He says, look closely at where the progress was most conspicuous, most dramatic. Where did the labor hour prices fall fastest for major consumer goods? The trail leads, he says, not to the doors of those firms that work under conditions of comparatively free competition, but precisely to the doors of the large concerns.
So the big leaps in living standards, affordable cars, electricity, washing machines, farm equipment, they came from the giants, not the small guys.
That's his finding. He uses agricultural machinery as a key example. The revolution in farming productivity was driven by large manufacturers.
Which culminates in that really provocative conclusion.
The shocking suspicion, yeah. Quote, that big business may have had more to do with creating that standard of life than with keeping it down.
Wow.
Now, he's not saying monopolies are always good or that there aren't abuses, but he's saying the standard knee-jerk reaction monopoly equals bad for consumers and output is based on looking at only a tiny static slice of reality. If you zoom out and look over time.
The picture reverses.
Right. The engine of progress seems to be linked to these large, powerful, even if only temporarily monopolistic entities.
This completely shifts the ground then. It implies that maybe the inefficiencies you see in a snapshot, the high prices, the market power, might actually be somehow necessary for the dynamic progress that happens later.
That's exactly it. He argues that the conclusions you draw from just static analysis, even if your observations about current market restrictions are technically correct in that moment, are utterly false when applied to capitalism as a whole over time, which forces us to adopt his evolutionary view.
Okay, so let's embrace that. If capitalism is fundamentally evolutionary, constantly changing from within, where does that impulse, that driving force, come from? Schumpeter's very specific about this, isn't he? It's not just external shocks like wars or population booms.
No, he sees those as conditioning factors, things that shape the environment but not the core engine. The real power source is internal.
And it comes down to innovation, basically.
Yes, but he breaks it down. He identifies 4 main types of innovation, usually driven by the entrepreneur, that set and keep the capitalist engine in motion.
Okay, what are they?
First, introducing new consumers' goods. Think the first automobiles or smartphones. Second, new methods of production or transportation, the assembly line, container shipping. Third, opening up new markets, finding new customer bases or geographical areas. And fourth, creating new forms of industrial organization like the limited liability corporation or the modern tech platform.
So it's not just about making more of the same stuff cheaper. It's about fundamentally changing what we consume and how we produce and organize it. It's qualitative.
Absolutely qualitative. He
Yes.
uses these powerful historical examples to make the point. Think about the budget of an ordinary laborer in 1760 versus 1940. It wasn't just bigger. It underwent a total process of qualitative change. The things people could buy, the things they considered necessities, completely transformed.
And the farm example is great, too, going from, crop rotation and maybe an ox.
The primitive plow, he calls it.
Right. To this fully mechanized thing of today, tractors, combines, chemical fertilizers linked into global markets by rail and shipping, it's a different world.
Or look at industry itself, iron and steel. From the old charcoal furnace tied to local forests to the massive coal-fired, scientifically managed modern furnace, or transport, the mail coach to the train, to the car, to the airplane. These aren't just tweaks. He calls them industrial mutations.
And industrial mutations, that biological term is deliberate, isn't it? Suggesting a fundamental change in the economic DNA.
Very deliberate. And this leads him to coin the term that captures this whole process, this industrial mutation that incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one, incessantly creating a new one.
And now for the big quote, the one everyone knows.
Here it is. This process of creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism.
It is what capitalism consists in, what every capitalist concern has got to live in.
Notice how critical that dual aspect is. Creative destruction. You can't separate them. The creation of the automobile inherently involves the destruction of the horse-drawn carriage industry.
They're two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. And that word, incessantly. Even if the big revolutions seem to come in waves, the underlying process, the pressure, the threat, it's constant.
He does clarify, though, that it often happens in bursts, right? Discrete rushes followed by periods of absorbing the changes.
Yes, he acknowledges that. There's the initial breakthrough, then a period of rapid adoption and expansion, which shakes everything up, followed by a relative lull as the economy digests the changes. But the overall process, viewed over decades, is incessant. It's the rhythm of the business cycle itself. Revolution, absorption, new equilibrium, then the next revelation starts brewing.
Okay, so if capitalism is this constant evolutionary flux, this fundamentally changes how we should analyze it. He says static analysis fails in two big ways. Let's take the first one, judging performance ex visu, like from a single point in time.
Right. If the structure is always changing, you can't judge the system's success based on whether it is perfectly efficient right now at this very moment. Schumpeter insists we have to judge its performance over time as it unfolds through decades or centuries.
This seems to clash directly with a lot of standard economics, which is often obsessed with achieving perfect equilibrium and efficiency today.
It does. And Schumpeter tackles that head-on with a really insightful principle, almost an analogy. He says, think about it. A system, any system, economic or other, that at every given point of time fully utilizes its possibilities to the best advantage.
So a system that's perfectly efficient in the short run
may yet in the long run be inferior to a system that does so at no given point of time.
Wow. So a messy, seemingly inefficient system today might actually be better for long-term growth. How can that be?
Because Schumpeter argues, the very failure to be perfectly efficient now specifically, the existence of temporary monopoly profits might be the essential condition for the level or speed of long-run performance.
Ah, so those excess profits aren't just waste, they're the fuel for the next big leap.
Exactly. Perfect competition, where profits are immediately competed away, simply doesn't generate the massive amounts of capital or the buffer to absorb the huge risks needed to do something truly revolutionary, like developing the first commercial jetliner or creating a whole new drug category. That takes vast resources and tolerance for failure.
So if policymakers rush in to break up any company that gets too profitable, aiming for that textbook ideal of perfect competition right now,
they might actually be killing the goose that lays the golden eggs of long-term progress. Those temporary monopoly profits, Schumpeter suggests, are what fund the R&D, the risky bets, the scaling up of innovations that ultimately benefit everyone decades later.
it's a defense of temporary market power as a necessary evil, or maybe just a necessary condition for dynamic progress.
Precisely. The short-term inefficiency, maybe slightly higher prices or restricted output today, is the price you pay for the revolutionary new product or service tomorrow that dramatically raises living standards overall. The real payoff isn't squeezing the last penny out of today's market, it's enabling tomorrow's transformation.
Okay, that's the first failure of static analysis. What's the second one? It has to do with looking at just one part of the system, like an oligopoly in isolation.
Yes, exactly. This is his critique of how economists often study oligopolies markets dominated by just a few large firms.
What do they typically see?
Well, the traditional theorist, focused on static equilibrium, looks at these few big players engaging in these complex moves and countermoves. Price signaling, advertising wars, maybe tacit collusion. Things that often look like they're just designed to keep prices high and restrict output.
Like a cozy club carving up the market.
Right. And they interpret this behavior based on the assumption that these firms are just maximizing their profits, given the momentary market conditions, as if nothing else matters.
But Schumpeter says that's missing the bigger picture.
Totally. He says this view ignores the firm's past and, crucially, its future. These companies aren't just sitting comfortably. They are desperately trying to keep on their feet on ground that is slipping away from under them.
Meaning?
Meaning they're constantly reacting to the last wave of creative destruction that maybe hurt their old business lines, and they're terrified of the next wave that could wipe them out completely. What looks like lazy monopolistic behavior might actually be frantic maneuvering for survival in a dynamic storm.
So a company investing heavily in a new, unproven technology, even while charging high prices for its current products, might not be fleecing consumers, but trying to stay alive.
It could be. The static view sees administering existing structures. Schumpeter says, no, the relevant problem is how it creates and destroys them. If you ignore the creation and destruction, your analysis of oligopoly behavior is likely just wrong, or at least incomplete.
Okay. This really sets up his idea of the kind of competition that truly matters. If static models miss the point, then the traditional view of competition price, quality, advertising must also be insufficient.
It is. Schumpeter acknowledges that economists moved beyond just simple price competition to include quality, service, branding, sales effort, and so on. But even that broader view, he argues, still operates within a rigid pattern of invariant conditions.
Meaning it assumes the basic rules of the game stay the same.
Right. It assumes the fundamental products, the production methods, the market structures are all fixed. Competition happens within that existing framework, nibbling at the margins.
Whereas Schumpeter's truly effective competition
Comes from the change in the framework itself. It comes from the new commodity, the new technology, the new source of supply, the new type of organization. Think the impact of the department store on small shops, or the impact of synthetic fibers on cotton growers.
This isn't just about tweaking things. It's about blowing up the existing structure. It's not one car company offering a slightly better warranty.
It's Henry Ford inventing the assembly line and mass-producing the Model T, making cars affordable for the masses and destroying the carriage trade. That's the competition Schumpeter cares about.
And he says this type of competition is fundamentally different in its impact.
Oh, absolutely. It's existential. It strikes not at the margins of the profits and the outputs of the existing firms, but at their foundations and their very lives.
Like the digital camera versus Kodak.
Perfect example. Kodak's rivals weren't just Fuji or Agfa slightly undercutting their film prices. The real threat was a completely new technology that made their core product obsolete. That's the essence of creative destruction.
Which leads to that incredibly vivid military analogy he uses.
Yeah, comparing the two types of competition, the marginal within-system kind versus the structural revolutionary kind.
How does he put it?
He says the competition that comes from creative destruction is as much more effective than the other as a bombardment is in comparison with forcing a door.
Wow. Forcing a door is just trying to get inside the existing structure. Bombardment takes down the whole building.
Precisely. That relentless bombardment, that threat of structural obsolescence, is the powerful long-run force that disciplines firms, expands output, and ultimately lowers real prices for consumers, even if it involves temporary periods of market dominance.
And, crucially, this threat works even when it's not actively happening.
Yes, that's a key insight. Competition acts not only when in being, but also when it is merely an ever-present threat.
So even a company that looks like a comfortable monopolist today
Still feels himself to be in a competitive situation. Why? Because the CEO knows that somewhere, maybe in a university lab, maybe in a competitor's R&D department, maybe in some startup's garage, someone is working on the next big thing that could completely destroy their current business model.
that fear keeps them on their toes.
Absolutely. That knowledge that the ground is slipping away from under them, as Schumpeter puts it, it forces them to behave, in the long run, in ways that are very similar to the perfectly competitive pattern. They have to keep innovating, keep cutting costs, keep improving quality, Not just because of who their rivals are today, but because of the potential rival, the disruptive technology of tomorrow.
You can really see that with big tech firms today, can't you? Constant fear of being the next MySpace or BlackBerry.
Exactly. That fear drives enormous investment and rapid change. Think about Amazon moving into groceries or cloud computing. It wasn't just competing with existing players, it was creating whole new organizational forms, new markets that threaten the foundations of older industries. Pure creative destruction.
Now, Schumpeter does concede that the static view isn't always wrong. He acknowledges there are situations where a lack of competition does lead to stagnation and high prices. He calls these fringe end cases.
Right. He uses the example of small-scale neighborhood retail to illustrate this.
What's the picture he paints there?
He describes a typical local street with lots of small shops. They tend to avoid fierce price wars, maybe relying more on personal service, habit, atmosphere. They often stick as to methods to the local tradition. It can lead to a kind of stagnating routine.
And the static theory predicts a specific negative outcome here, right? This pyramiding idea.
Yes. The model predicts that as more little shops inevitably open up in the same area, the economic space around each gets smaller. Since they can't or won't compete effectively on price, maybe their costs are too high or there's a local understanding not to undercut each other.
They try to make up for fewer customers by charging more.
Exactly. They raise prices, maybe through tacit agreement, to cover their costs on lower volume. So you end up with this inefficient cluster, rising prices, falling sales per shop, what Schumpeter calls a pyramiding of irrational small businesses surviving by collectively charging consumers more.
And Schumpeter says, yeah, that happens sometimes.
He admits such cases do occur, but then he immediately pushes them aside. He says these are furthest removed from all that is most characteristic of capitalist activity. They aren't the dynamic core. They're pockets of inefficiency, often clinging on in sectors less touched by major innovation.
And crucially, they're transient. They won't last forever. Why?
Because the competition that really matters in retail isn't another identical little shop opening up next door. It's the arrival of the agents of creative destruction.
Which in retail are?
The department store, the chain store, the mail-order house, and the supermarket. These aren't just slightly better versions of the old shops. They're entirely new forms of organization built on scale, logistics, and efficiency.
They operate on a completely different cost structure.
Totally. They can buy in bulk, manage inventory better, offer wider selection things. The small local shop, hampered by his cost structure, simply cannot match. It's an industrial revolution hitting retail.
And the result is inevitable destruction of that old pyramid.
Right. Those inefficient local shops get wiped out, bound to destroy those pyramids sooner or later. The businesses disappear, which is painful for the owners, but the consumer benefits massively from lower prices and more choice.
So the big takeaway here is that any economic theory that leaves out this core element, this constant destruction and creation,
is like in his famous phrase, staging Hamlet without the Danish prince. You've missed the main character, the driving force, and the whole play makes no sense.
Okay, let's broaden out from the pure economics. Recognizing creative destruction as central forces us to confront some really significant social and political consequences. It implies, well, a lot of turbulence.
That's the really uncomfortable part, isn't it? The process absolutely requires destruction. For the new thing to succeed, the new industry, the new technology, the old one, must decline and often disappear.
Which means jobs are lost.
Jobs are lost. Skills become obsolete. Entire communities built around an old industry can be devastated. Think coal towns or factory towns after automation or offshoring. Firms go bankrupt. Ways of life vanish. The institutions supporting the old ways erode.
And that creates enormous social friction, naturally. People resist changes that destroy their livelihoods or communities.
Of course, the system needs failure and displacement to function, to drive progress. But that failure is deeply painful for those experiencing it.
This brings us back to a distinction Schumpeter makes, right? Between judging the economic performance and making a moral judgment.
Yes, this is crucial for him and for us as analysts trying to understand him. He argues that our appraisal of capitalism's economic performance, its objective ability to generate wealth, raise living standards over time, has to be kept separate from our moral approval or disapproval of the social costs involved.
So we can say, objectively, the supermarket model delivered cheaper food to more people than the old corner stores. That's an economic appraisal.
Right. And at the same time, we can feel genuine sympathy for the families whose corner stores went out of business. That's a moral or social judgment. Schumpeter insists these are distinct unless you specifically adopt a utilitarian view where economic output is the ultimate moral good.
So acknowledging the pain doesn't negate the analysis of the system's dynamic power.
Exactly. It allows us to understand the mechanism. Creative destruction is the engine without necessarily celebrating the immediate fallout. We're analyzing how it works, not necessarily saying we like every aspect of it.
Okay, let's try to place Schumpeter now in relation to other big thinkers. He actually acknowledges Karl Marx, doesn't he?
He does. He gives Marx credit, saying Marx long ago emphasized the evolutionary nature of capitalism. Both saw it as restless, constantly changing, revolutionizing production. That shared focus on dynamism sets them both apart from static equilibrium thinkers.
But they diverge pretty sharply on what drives that dynamic change, right?
Hugely. For Marx, the engine is internal contradiction, dialectical change, driven fundamentally by class struggle. The conflict between the owners of capital and the workers, interacting with the changing forces of production, leads inevitably to social revolution.
The revolution is social, aiming to overturn the class structure.
Yes. Whereas for Schumpeter, the engine is the entrepreneur and innovation, the industrial mutation.
The genius inventor, the disruptive business leader.
Right. The driving force is technological and organizational novelty, spurred by the pursuit of those temporary monopoly profits. So Schumpeter reframes the revolution as primarily industrial, this constant gale of creative destruction within the economic structure itself, rather than a social revolution driven by class conflict. Marx sees the system destroying itself socially. Schumpeter sees it constantly destroying and rebuilding itself economically.
That's a critical difference. The focus shifts from ownership and class to innovation and disruption.
And then there's the contrast with Keynes, who was Schumpeter's contemporary, and in many ways his great rival in terms of influence. Keynes was all about stability, wasn't he?
Right. Keynesian economics is largely focused on smoothing out the business cycle, managing aggregate demand, fighting unemployment, preventing those big crashes. The goal is short-term macroeconomic stability.
Which puts him in direct tension with Schumpeter's core idea here. Keynes wants to calm the storm. Schumpeter sees the storm as the source of progress. Keynes is focused on the smoothness of the ride in the short run.
While Schumpeter cares about the long-run speed and the ultimate level the economy reaches, even if the ride is bumpy.
Exactly. So if a government uses Keynesian policies to stabilize things, maybe bailing out failing companies, subsidizing old industries to save jobs in the short term.
What's the Schumpeterian cost of that?
The cost is potentially sacrificing long-run dynamism. If you constantly intervene to prevent the destruction part of creative destruction, if you protect incumbent firms and old ways of doing things from the competitive gale,
You slow down innovation.
you risk choking off the very process that generates long-term growth. Using public money to prop up inefficient structures essentially acts as a brake on the whole system's ability to adapt and evolve.
So there's a fundamental trade-off, trying to minimize today's pain versus enabling tomorrow's progress. You can't easily maximize both.
That seems to be Schumpeter's point. Policymakers face this really uncomfortable choice. The turbulence, the job losses, the bankruptcies, they aren't just unfortunate side effects. They are, in this view, necessary conditions for the immense wealth creation that defines capitalism's long-term trajectory. Trying to eliminate the turbulence might mean you never reach the higher altitude.
This has been, well, a really deep dive into the absolute core of Schumpeter's theory. It's powerful, it's challenging, and it forces you to see the economy in a completely different light. That instability is the price of progress.
It really forces a rethink of how we even measure economic success. Is stability the main goal? Or is long-run dynamic growth the goal, even if it requires embracing instability? If a policy delivers stability today but kills innovation for tomorrow, Schumpeter would say that's a failure.
Okay, so as we wrap up our look at Chapter 7, let's pose a couple of questions for you, the listener, to chew on, especially thinking about our world today with AI and digital disruption happening so fast.
First, think about that ex visu error, judging things only by the snapshot. In our current political climate, where success often seems measured in quarterly earnings or monthly job numbers, should we view the turbulence of creative destruction as just a necessary evil we have to put up with? Or is it actually a necessary condition for progress, something societies need to figure out how to manage and maybe even encourage rather than just resist?
That's a tough one. And related to that, second question. Given the pressures of news cycles, elections, and the very real human cost of displacement, Can societies realistically manage the social upheaval that this perennial gale inevitably causes? Can we handle the job losses, the community disruption, without eventually succumbing to the temptation to hit the brakes, to protect the status quo, and in doing so, potentially stalling the engine of innovation itself?
Yeah, these aren't easy questions, but the enduring lesson from this chapter, I think, is that the reality of capitalism is just fundamentally different from the neat static picture often painted in textbooks. You can't grasp its power to transform lives, to raise living standards, unless you grapple with its inherently evolutionary, disruptive, and yes, often destructive nature.
And having shown just how powerful and successful this dynamic engine is, Schumpeter then makes this fascinating pivot in the chapters that follow. He asks the even more provocative question, why might this incredibly successful system ultimately fail?
Right, that's where we're headed next. We move from analyzing the system's economic strengths to probing its potential sociological and cultural weaknesses. We'll look more at his views on monopoly, but crucially, his prediction that the role of the entrepreneur might actually decline as innovation becomes more bureaucratic, more routinized inside big corporations.
And maybe the most startling part, his argument about how capitalism's very success could breed a kind of cultural and intellectual hostility towards it, the rise of an intellectual class critical of the very system that supports it. The ultimate irony.
Exactly. Why might the dynamism he just celebrated end up sowing the seeds of its own potential demise? That's the puzzle for our next deep dive.
Definitely stay tuned for that. Thank you for joining us for this exploration of a truly essential chapter in economic thought. We'll see you next time on the Deep Dive.